You haven't heard what I said yet. So yeah, as Dawn mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about birds along the Missouri River. But first, I want to introduce my office a little bit. Our mission at the Avian Science Center is to promote ecological awareness and informed decision-making through collecting, synthesizing, and disseminating information about Western birds. And we have a small but dedicated staff. You may recognize Dick Hutto. He's our director. He's been the ornithology professor, among many other things, at the University of Montana for about 30 years. Anna Nosen on my left in that photo, she's actually our Riparian program director, so I'll be talking about her work. And Megan Filling works on lots of different projects in our office and is working on her master's degree right now. So what we do with birds is we really just try to listen to what they have to tell us about the world that they live in and that we live in. We use birds to tell us about their response to different land management actions, our actions in terms of development and the way that we leave our footprint on the earth. We use birds as indicators. They can tell us things about vegetation structure, water quality. They can tell us about impacts of recreation. And they can tell us about landscape context, connectivity, things that are happening at a much larger scale. So we use birds a lot as tools to evaluate restoration, whether it's in riparian systems or conifer forest. Idea being, if you're going to restore something to its natural condition, bird communities ought to look similar in the restored site compared to a reference site, some target habitat you're trying to get to. So we do a lot of different things in our office. The thing I spend most of my time on is coordinating this statewide bird monitoring program, where we do surveys all across the state of Montana in all habitat types, all land ownerships, including private lands. That keeps me pretty busy, as you can see. Some of the synthesis that we do is we collect all this data about birds, we crunch numbers, and we develop models that can do things like help us predict where you might find a warbling vireo. I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end if we have time, but this kind of corridor is a river, and if you wanted to find a warbling vireo, the places in blue are less likely to allow you to turn one up than the hot colors. We provide a lot of field training and on-the-job real-life wildlife biologist experience for undergraduate students and recent graduates, just kind of starting off in their career as wildlife biologists. And we do several public education and outreach programs. Our main one right now is, we call it our Bird's Eye View Education Program. That one just wants to jump forward. And it takes place at songbird banding stations. And we work mostly in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin, and part of the program is to kind of evaluate birds' response to the cleanup efforts on the Clark Fork and teach the public about the importance of riparian habitats and maintaining their health so that we continue to protect our environment from mining and other activities. And we've done some citizen science projects. Raise your hand if you helped out with the flammulated owl surveys a few years back. All right, you're still here. So yeah, we helped get that effort going a few years back. And then most recently, Auduboners in Missoula and the Bitterroot Valley helped Megan out this summer with her thesis work looking for Lewis's woodpeckers in the Bitterroot and in the Clark Fork. So we do a lot of different things, but now I'm going to come back to the Missouri River and tell you about our monitoring program. It actually begins up on the Madison River. And we kicked off this program off in 2002 and 2003, so it is already 10 years old. And we've got sites that run from just south of Ennis all the way out through the Missouri River Breaks section to Fred Robinson Bridge, if you know where that is. We were really interested in not just birds along the river, but birds that use riparian habitat. And I'm going to use that phrase a lot. Does anybody know what riparian habitat is? Or does everyone know? Go ahead.
The vegetated areas along water courses.
Perfect. He's like a dictionary. So yeah, it's all that vegetation that goes right along the river. And that's what a lot of bird species, especially songbirds, are keying in on. So instead of just plunking points down along the river anywhere, we had some poor soul hand digitize all these little riparian patches using aerial photos. It wasn't me. And from all of those patches along this works sometimes, Missouri and Madison, we selected 110 patches that we were going to survey, and we put points down in those patches. It's just really as many as fit based on the size, and spacing them 250 meters apart. So this covers a big area. So why is this kind of a monitoring program so important? Well, we know rivers and riparian areas are important for lots of things. They deliver all kinds of ecological services, from clean water to filtering the water, providing habitat for fish, many other wildlife species other than birds. And for birds in particular, we know that riparian areas are the most diverse habitat in Western North America. There's no other habitat out there that has more bird species in it. And in Montana, we know that about at least 60% of our breeding birds depend on these riparian areas. And yet riparian areas are very limited in areal extent, right? They're these little stringers of habitat that run along streams and around lakes and wetlands. So does anybody know what percent of Montana's land is riparian habitat? 3? Yeah, that's about right. Okay, so we've got this huge state, and we've got this really important habitat, and it only makes up 3%. And we know riparian areas have a lot of threats to them as well. There's dams, there's dewatering, and then there's development, right? We all love to live in beautiful places right along water. So, we at the Avian Science Center think it's really important to monitor riparian areas and for the state to have a statewide program on major rivers to keep track of what birds are doing in this important habitat type. And so we've got a big chunk of it covered right now with the Missouri and the Madison. Folks funding this work, it's mostly PPL Montana as part of their dam relicensing agreement, and the BLM, which owns a lot of land along the rivers and also has an interest in understanding what their management does to the bird community. Okay, so the program objectives are, we'd like to continue monitoring birds every 3 to 4 years, and that will allow us to do things like provide periodic density estimates, estimate population trends, and look at what we call patch persistence. Idea being, if you go to a spot and you detect a willow flycatcher, if it's a nice place to live, if you're a willow flycatcher and you come back 3 years later, it might not be the same willow flycatcher, but it's likely to be occupied because it's a high quality spot for that particular species. A second objective will be to produce different kinds of products from the data that we collect. So we're developing these predictive maps, and we hope that the information will help guide restoration and management, prioritize conservation, things like that. And then in only monitoring every third or fourth year, we have time to do specific projects that might look at particular management actions, like Russian olive removal. There's a lot of work being done to curb conifer encroachment, things like that. And I will talk about we are doing a Russian olive project. I'll talk about that later. But beginning with long-term monitoring, we work really hard out there, let me tell you. You can see. We use canoes to access the sites. That's actually me in the front and Megan kicking back in the back. We work hard when we work hard, but the river, you got to float a long ways in between these patches on the Missouri River breaks, so you got to get some rest sometime. We do point counts, which is standing in one place for 10 minutes, and we count every bird that we see and hear and record a distance to that bird. And recording that distance allows us to do fancy statistical things and get better estimates of density. We collect vegetation data so that we can understand the structure. So things like canopy cover, shrub cover, which species are there effects of grazing. So to this point, we did surveys in 2004 and 2005. They split the river in half that year and did half the surveys in each of those years. 2008 and 2012, we've done the whole thing in one season. To date, we have amassed about 20,000 bird detections. We've detected 128 bird species, which is 54% of Montana's birds. So I told you at the beginning that we know about 60% of Montana's birds breed in riparian habitats. So, after 3 visits to these sites, we're getting a very complete list of birds that use these habitats. We've got 42 species with good sample sizes, meaning we have enough detections to do some of the density estimation that we'd like to do and generate population trends. We've done additional surveys for species of concern, collaborating with the Montana Natural Heritage Program and FWP, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, on cuckoos and eastern and western screech owls. Last summer we did some playback surveys. And we see some crazy birds out there. We've seen a northern parula and this gorgeous yellow-throated vireo, and a rose-breasted grosbeak and orchard oriole this summer. Oh, and I was supposed to ask you guys, what do you think the most common bird species is that we encounter? Robin is close, but yellow warbler wins. Yeah, we've got about 3,400 detections of yellow warblers. It's pretty amazing. The majority of the species that we detect are riparian specialists, meaning that they're relatively restricted to riparian habitats. They either don't occur other places or don't occur in high numbers, or they're associated, which means, yeah, they occur some other places, but man, they're a whole lot more abundant in riparian areas. So over 60% of the species that we detect fall into those categories. We do get some non-riparian species because we record all birds that we see and hear. So, we detect things like brewer sparrows and clay-colored sparrows, which aren't riparian species, but the sage and the grass habitat comes right to the river edge in many places, and so we still detect things like that. A lot of the birds we detect are things that you think of immediately when you think of a river, things like pelicans, eagles, the mergansers, and then there's a whole host of songbird species, which you may or may not know a whole lot about. Here is our top, I think it's a top 14 list. So you can see robin is on there. It was number 4. You were so close. And again, I've shown you the riparian dependent species in yellow. Those in blue are, occur in lots of different habitat types. And you can see yellow warbler, 100% of points. If you go stand in a patch of riparian habitat, I can almost guarantee you will hear a yellow warbler. They are thick out there. House wrens right up there at 90%. Least flycatchers, American robin, brown-headed cowbird. That's an interesting species. It's not a riparian species. Why? Does any ideas on why we get so many brown-headed cowbirds? They do, yeah. So this is a grass species, probably historically. Probably followed the bison herds around, and it's a sneaky species because they don't build their own nests. They cheat. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests and let those parents raise their own young. And the idea is that historically, bison moved through the plains, and so birds nesting in the area might have had their nests parasitized, but most of those species kind of evolved with brown-headed cowbirds, learned some strategies, abandon the nest, build another one on top of it, and when the bison moved on, they tried again, and many of them had successful nests. Well, now our landscape is quite fragmented, and we have bison that don't move. We have a lot of cattle, and so we've basically created a lot more habitat for brown-headed cowbirds, and we've created a critter for them to follow around that doesn't move very well. So we have a lot more brown-headed cowbirds in places where they probably weren't historically, and one of those places is riparian areas. And then as you move down this list, you can quickly see that by the time you get to the bottom of the list, these are species that are detected only on about a third of the points. So we start out with these super abundant species like yellow warblers and house wrens and robins, and we very quickly taper to a place where a majority of the species are not that frequently detected. And so this graph kind of presents that in another way. The tips of these bars in red are those species we detect a lot of. This is just 2008 survey data, so here I've shown you those that have more than 100 detections. By now it's probably closer to 500 or 1,000. But the point of this graph is all those species in blue are the many, many, many other species that aren't real common, but that big list of species is what characterizes riparian areas. It's the bird diversity. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today, is why these places are so diverse. So you've got the usual suspects like yellow warblers, but then you've got these real specialists like the northern water thrush. So in 2008, we had 1,200 yellow warblers, 4 northern water thrushes. So a real difference in commonness. And the reason for that is that riparian habitats are diverse. They're structurally complex, and they're highly productive. And so when you combine all of those pieces, you get lots of different niches, little different places for different birds to make a living. So you might have several different species of woodpeckers, some using the main trunks, some using the branches that go off the end, like downy woodpeckers looking for a dead branch sticking off that they're going to build their nest in. You have birds in the top of the canopy, you have birds in the middle of the canopy, you have birds using these shrub layers, you even have birds down on the ground kind of skulking around. So when you get this kind of complexity, you get lots of different niches, and that builds a really diverse community in which competition generally prevents a small number of species from just taking over, and diversity becomes the thing that characterizes it. The structural and the habitat diversity that we see in riparian areas starts at a large scale with river morphology. So this is Three Forks area. Not sure. There we go. Let me get this. Sometimes this works. Oh, well. It really is a rule, right? They never work. So the bottom of the green triangle at the bottom is the headwaters of the Missouri River. So you can see where those rivers are coming in, and it's very braided and meandering. You're going to get a very different kind of habitat that when it shoots into that canyon and is a real channel, very different vegetation. Same with between the section between when it comes out of the canyon between Helena and Great Falls, right? When it comes out and becomes this slow, large, meandering river with lots of oxbows and side channels, that is going to produce a very different habitat type as well. Then you've got landscape context. What's coming down to the river? Is it kind of a open plain that floods a lot, or is it a high bench? And nowadays, you've got agriculture in there too. Then you get down to the patch level. And again, that's another place that you'll see differences. So you have places where you have a closed canopy, other places where you have a real open canopy along some edges, and then other places that are open. And then you may not even have trees. You may have just a shrub layer. And so when you get down underneath the canopy, get out of your airplane and get back on the ground, you're really just seeing many different kinds of riparian habitats that create many different kinds of homes for our birds. And so I think, okay, yeah, one more. And so generally the more complex the patch type, the greater the bird diversity. So you can imagine the top one with that shrub layer is going to have a different suite of species than this bottom one that doesn't have that shrubby understory. Okay, so let's put our natural history caps on and think about what attributes about these different species are allowing them to key in on these specific habitats. So forests with large cottonwood trees, you're going to get species in there like the western wood pewee, Bullock's oriole, and downy woodpeckers. Okay, so downy woodpeckers, all our woodpeckers are going to need pretty large diameter trees, right? If you're going to excavate something to put your cavity in it, you can't do it in a little tiny water birch or something like that. You're going to need a cottonwood and one that's pretty good size. Both the oriole and the western wood pewees tend to build their nests from large cottonwood branches. The pewees plunk them right on top of the branch, and they're a pretty big flycatcher, so they need a pretty big platform. And the Bullock's orioles build these beautiful hanging nests, and they like a real open canopy structure so that nest can hang down and they can go in and out and feed their young. Cottonwoods are not long-lived species, so they tend to die and start rotting, and so that's another reason that there's a lot of food in riparian habitats, and woodpeckers are keying in on those. They are looking for these dead and dying trees that likely have a lot of bark beetles and larvae and things to eat. Oh, and then one other thing about the flycatchers. So we know a little bit about flycatchers just from their names, right? They sit on a perch, they fly out, they catch something, and they come back. So these open kind of gallery style cottonwood forests are ideal for wood pewees. Other flycatchers are using a different part of the cottonwood forest. So the western kingbird on the lower right, and as well as eastern kingbirds, they're kind of using the edges of the cottonwood forest. They're darting out to the outside. They're using the more the parts with an open understory. then you've got things like the least flycatchers, and they are keying in on young stands of cottonwood, or the tall shrub understory. They really seem to like the water birch and the alder, and you need that component before you're going to see those species. If you've just got these big tank cottonwood sentinels there without some new regeneration coming up underneath, this species won't be there. You add that complexity, or you go to a younger stand, and voila, these flycatchers are everywhere. Other species are looking for a really dense understory. So they still want the canopy from the cottonwoods, but they want the thick shrubs in there too. These are things like the catbird and the warbling vireo in the middle, and yellow-breasted chats. So these are all species that forage and look for their food lower in the understory. They're not flitting around in the tops of the canopies as much. Maybe warbling vireos. They're all over the place. And they're generally nesting lower too, especially the catbirds and the chats. And generally, the more dense the understory, the better for those two species, for catbirds and chats in particular. Then there's birds that like the shrub layer, and they'd rather have it without the canopy coming over the top. These are things like the willow flycatcher, common yellowthroat, and the lazuli bunting. Okay. Willow flycatchers, true to its name, you get these extensive willow patches, these sandbars, places where maybe the river morphology is a little bit too fluid to have cottonwood trees growing and being able to stand still for long enough before that channel moves. But willows do just fine. And so this flycatcher is going to key in on that habitat. That's where it forages and builds nests. Common yellowthroats, they might not even need a shrub layer. They're often using the low grasses and reeds and the real low shrub layer. And then the lazuli buntings, they're on the drier end of things. So on these parts of the river that are more channelized, and you have these narrow strips of riparian habitat going up to a dry bench. That's where you'll find the lazuli buntings. Okay, so with all that natural history in our heads, we can understand a really complicated graph like this. Okay, so, and you can do it, I'll walk you through it. And this is the kind of data that we have collected and crammed into a graph to be able to let birds tell us the story of where they want to live and why they want to live there. Okay, so on this bottom axis, you've got forbs going this way, and so as the forb or herbaceous layer gets higher and a greater percent cover, willow flycatchers like that. These dots in black are places where they occupied that patch for 2 years. The places in gray are places where they were there 1 out of 2 years, and then the open circles are places where we did not detect willow flycatchers. So they like forbs. They like it when canopy height, cover, and deciduous trees and grazing are low. Those are getting low on that end. And then they like shrub cover because they're kind of clustered in here. And they're not crazy about invasives like weeds basically, and grass and conifers. As those increase, they decrease. So, all the data that we're collecting out there, it fits intuitively with what we know about willow flycatchers, which is reassuring. It means we have good powers of observation. But by collecting detailed vegetation information, we can squish it all together and try to understand what factors really are driving habitat selection for this species. Okay, we'll do one more and then I'll stop. Song sparrows. So these are, they're a little less clustered, but they're definitely pushed on the left side of the graph. So that indicates that they are liking when shrub cover and diversity are high. They start to disappear as canopy height, deciduous trees, and grass get too high. And then the other axis, the vertical axis is they're less choosy, but there is some tendency toward wanting high tree diversity and canopy cover. Low tree diversity and canopy cover. See, I can't keep straight. And a moderate amount of grazing intensity and forbs. So, okay.
You have a question?
Yes.
Did you place all those dots yourself?
No, a computer did it for me, thankfully. That would be awful, wouldn't it? So we have just completed the third cycle of revisiting all of our long-term monitoring points this past summer in 2012. And so we're still analyzing most of our trend data, but we did do a subset of points in 2010. So we did do some preliminary trend estimates using that data. So the first point would be the 2004/5. The second data point was from 2008, and here we are in 2010. And I almost didn't include these because it's bad news. We're able to model about 12 species, and most of them were in decline. And so this is preliminary. It's 5 years of data, and it was only a subset of our points. But it's interesting nonetheless, right? And it makes me really glad that we've continued this program and have 2 more years after 2010 to do a real robust look at trend estimates for these species. Because there's lots of reasons why riparian birds might be in decline, but we won't know that unless we're monitoring, unless we're returning to the same places year after year to check in with those populations. Yeah.
Do you have data of any that have gone up, increased?
Let's see. House wren took a big drop and then back up. I don't think any of them were increasing. There were some where there was no statistically significant trend in one direction or another.
Is that associated with habitat destruction
At this point we wouldn't be able to get at causality. But that is something we can look at over time. We can certainly, we take the same vegetation data every year, so we can look for changes in vegetation. None of our sites are disappearing, so it's not like, the population that we were looking at is completely gone and, a house was built over it or something like that.
With entomologists about insect populations?
No, but that would be so cool. Yeah, it's hard. That is hard to tie to bird studies, but yeah, that insects certainly drive populations, especially during the breeding season.
West Nile virus?
And West Nile virus, I know that was a big deal for a few years. I haven't heard much about it.
Did you get any data on pesticide use?
I don't know. Yeah, we're getting a good laundry list, though. This is good. One more question.
Wondering how robust these species are if you looked at 2011 and the high water.
Right.
And how that would play into this.
Right. And that's what I'm hoping that, so that's an important point right there, is that, with 3 data points, 3 years of data, we have all kinds of crazy things happen, right? We know that the rivers were really high, both in 2008 and in 2011. And so we need a bunch of years to get that background variation into the models to generate these trends, so that we're not just looking at 3 points going up and down. We know there's a lot of variability and things go up and down. That may not mean that the population is going up and down until we kind of control that background noise. So yeah. But that is one of the problems with not going every year, right? If you went every single year, you'd have a nice, smooth look at it. So there's trade-offs. You save money and do other things, or you hit the same place every year. The statewide program that I do, we do collect data every single year. So that program has made a different trade-off. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Russian olive. Russian olive is non-native, and it spreads really easily in riparian areas. It's got those little olives. They float down the river, and they germinate very readily and grow very quickly. So on the Missouri River, the BLM initiated a removal effort in 2008, mostly in the Missouri River breaks section. And so this was an opportunity that we had because we already had a long-term monitoring program on the ground and in place. We already had points set up in the places where they wanted to remove Russian olive, and we went in and added anywhere else that they wanted to remove this invasive. We added additional points, and so we were able to basically leverage off of our long-term program and nest another study right on top of it, using resources efficiently, using the same staff, things like that. And it's a small study, about 73 points. So we have 30 reference points. So these are they're points and sites along the river that don't have any Russian olive in them, right? That's what we're trying to get back to. We have some control sites that are on private lands or that are not going to have the Russian olive removed. So that's an important control to have in the study. And then we collected data before the treatment, before the removal, in 2008. 2010, we caught them in the middle of the act, so we had both. And then this last summer, they had completed all the treatments, and so we were able to get the post-treatment data for all 20 of those points. The good news about Russian olive on the Missouri River is not that prevalent. It's generally encountered as a shrub or a tree, and we rarely see more than 20% cover, meaning 20% of the trees or shrubs in the area. So that's a good thing. It means that the BLM really has caught this early in the infestation, and hopefully by being proactive and removing those trees, they'll either prevent Russian olive from having an impact on bird communities altogether, or at least reverse things early on before they take hold. There's places in Utah and where it's just solid Russian olive, and they have a lot of work to do. And at that point, it becomes a real risk too. If you remove the Russian olive and don't replace it with cottonwoods or some other kind of native shrub, well, then you've taken away the only structure that was there. So it gets to be a real management problem quickly. So, so this is part of the good news, is that it's not real invasive yet. The short-term response from the bird community seems to be pretty minimal. We tested about 12 species, and the only one that showed even a hint of a response was the least flycatcher. So on the left, we have the reference, relative abundance and the reference sites. And when we tested for differences between years, before and after, between the different treatments, densities in the control treatment were a little bit lower than in the restoration treatment, suggesting that perhaps even just a few years after the treatment, least flycatchers are responding in those restored areas and are there in higher numbers. But again, this is another very preliminary result, and we were there again last summer, so we'll be able to look at that data again and see if things changed in those 2 years. So that could be the end of my talk. As I said, this work is supported by PPL Montana and the BLM. And then but the last slides I have are kind of looking a little bit more at those predictive maps that we have churned out with our data. If that's interesting, I just have a few more slides on that I can go through. Yeah, it's less natural history, perhaps, but this is where I think it gets really fun. Okay, so these species distribution models. The idea is we can use lots of different layers, including bird information, to help predict where birds go so that we don't have to count every single bird out there in the world, which would be a lot fun, but a lot of work, right? So first we add environmental data. It might be a hydrology layer. It might be distance to forest. Then we add the bird observations. Then we can use a kind of a canned modeling program called Maxent and squish all those different layers together to predict, to use the data. You know, we only went to those little red dots. So we used the data that we collected at those sites to project and predict where birds might occur outside of that little narrow strip of points that we visited. And we've done this for the Madison River. They produced National Wetland Inventory, NWI, information for that section of the river. And it basically is information on the hydrology and kind of the soil potential. It gets at the potential habitat, not what's actually there, but what that habitat should look like based on the underlying soil and hydrology. So we use that data because it was available remotely. And we were able to pool all of our data and try to fit models for 39 species. And I think this is where this becomes Anna's world instead of mine, but yeah, I think this is where she tells us a little bit more about the layers she used in greater detail. So she used these different riparian habitats that were classified by those NWI layers. She looked at the amount of riparian forest within a kilometer, so she drew little circles and calculated how much riparian habitat was there. Then she looked at human use and was able to combine that with agriculture and development. Then she looked at mean annual precipitation. And squishing all that together, she had a pretty nice kind of background set of information with which to use to match with our presence absence data and use that to make some predictions. So she was able to generate 13 models, and here's just one example for the least flycatcher. So you can see that there are real, hot spots for this bird near Three Forks and near Ennis. The places in blue are less likely to hold these species. There are also places where our data might fall apart a little bit, right? Maybe the environmental variables there, maybe we didn't get in a lot of samples in that particular habitat. But that's the neat thing about modeling is you can look at your model. then you can go out the next summer and say, okay, well, it's predicting that we ought to have least flycatchers here, so let's go out and see if they're there. Or, you know, it's saying that there shouldn't be least flycatchers here. Let's go check that out. Then you can come back with that data and use that to improve your model, refine it, and maybe even get it a little bit tighter. And the reason that I am getting pretty excited about these is my hope is that they can be useful for directing conservation, perhaps prioritizing conservation easements, or maybe identifying, oh, there's an easement right here that we already have, but it's only green. What do we need to turn it red? What kind of habitat modifications or improvements could we use to improve that habitat for XYZ species? You can build these maps for lots and lots of species, even other taxa. It doesn't have to just be birds, and you can nest them all on top and kind of identify hot spots. What are the places where lots and lots of species might benefit from a single conservation action? So I think there's a lot of different ways that this can be used by land trusts, by managers, even by private landowners who are just interested. And so yeah, this will be one of the big products coming out of our 2012 analysis, which is being done in 2013.
Do you know where the